I'm reading from John 14, 12 to 15, and 21 to 24. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do. And in fact, will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. They who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me. And those who love me will be loved by my Father. And I will love them and reveal myself to them. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it you will reveal yourself to us and not to the world? Jesus answered him, Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them. And we will come to them and make our home with them. Whoever does not love me does not keep my word, and the word that you hear is not mine, but is from the Father who sent me. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
I think it would be safe to say that all of us have had someone in our lives that has influenced how we do things and how we think about things, and helped us develop into the person that we have become. We've all been influenced by lots of things that others have done. In fact, I think we learn best when people are intentional about setting an example for us. Now, there's an argument of, that nature versus nurture thing, that, and while it's true that we are born with some senses of who we are, how we behave, I believe, is inherited not from our genetic makeup, but probably from those around us, at least in a big part. There's a woman who tells a story about a pet that she had, a dog that she cared for very much. This dog was pregnant and somehow got out of the house and was involved in an accident, and the effects of that accident required that the dog's back legs had to be removed. Now, this story, it's not a funny story, but it's a sweet story, and if you bear with me, I think you'll see my point. The puppies that this dog was pregnant with survived, and they were born normally. And the mother dog recovered well, and she even was able to get around, learning how to use her front legs and kind of, dragging her back end around with her. And one day, looking out the window, this woman who had this dog that she loved so much saw that the mother dog was out and about in the yard, kind of dragging herself around, and she was being followed by her new litter of puppies. And they were all walking along with their mother, just using their front paws and dragging their healthy legs behind them. You see, it didn't matter how healthy those puppies' back legs were. They learned to walk by watching their mother. And so their mother and her infirmities transformed them from perfectly healthy bodies of puppies because of the power of example. I often think of the examples of folks in my life that meant the most to me. I think about the people whose shoes I walk behind. If we're going to use that metaphor, I had a grandmother who taught me how to be resilient and have strength and be kind. And I had a mother who taught me about faith and hope and serving. And I had a great mentor who taught me through example to be creative and courageous. Now, I have to admit, I haven't always done well following in these footpaths, because I'm like all of you. I've decided along the way that I knew better where to walk. And so I got off the path many times. But luckily, they were a good example to me, and I was able to get back in line. Which causes me then to think, as I grew older and hopefully a little more wiser, what about the people that walk behind me? That illustration of the dog and her pups reminds us that whether we know it or not, or want want to or not, someone has been influenced by us. And I can only hope that they were watching when I was doing my best at giving an example and not my worst. The principle of example affirms who we are. What we do and how we live our lives matters, and it's not just for ourselves, but it's for those who follow behind us. So as Christians, this is especially important if we want people to walk like us and mimic and have an example of what it means to be a Christian, then we need to walk like Christ. And that's what the gospel lesson is about today in John's gospel writing. He's telling the disciples, Jesus is telling the disciples that they can show how much they appreciate what Jesus' example to them if they will love like he loves, and if they will follow him like he hopes they will. Because, and this is not news to folks, we who call ourselves Christians have Jesus as the example to follow. And not just because it's a good thing to do, but because through Jesus' teachings and example, we learn the most important things, two really important things. One, we have a God who loves us. And the other thing is that we have to live and love like Christ. And so John is relating Jesus talking to the disciples, and Jesus is revealing to them what it is that they now need to do, how they need to continue. And he points out that this is how you do it. If you love me, he said, you will keep my commandments. And we know that Jesus said the most important commandment is to love one another. And so Jesus provided that example on how we are supposed to walk in our faith, how we are supposed to treat others, and how we are supposed to live an example that we would want people to follow. This was a gift to them, as it is a gift to us. The gift of knowledge of God's love for us should brighten our day every single day as we remember how much God loves us. But more importantly, then we need to remember that that love can't be something that we keep to ourselves, but that we need to live each and every day. John's gospel says they will know who you belong to by the way you love one another. No flowery language, no complicated theology, no difficult paradigms, no parable to try to make sense of. It's simply, they will know who you belong to by the way that you love one another. Can it get any simpler than that? There really isn't anything else that I really ought to add. I should just sit down and be quiet, because what else am I going to say? But it's that simple. And the more we realize that these examples of Jesus, that we love God and that we love each other, it shouldn't be all that hard for us. It's pretty straightforward. And the goal is not to be complicated, but to bring us closer to God, closer to one another. It's not about God trying to play hide and seek with us. That's not how it works. We humans have complicated God, because we forget that God simply wants us to seek after God and after good. And then after doing that and finding God and knowing God's love, then we are to seek out one another and to show that love. That's really all there is to it. And in John's gospel, John is relating what Jesus has told the disciples. This is how it works, folks. You are my disciples, and people will know who you belong to if you love one another. What better example could we have of how we should live our Christian lives? God's goal in sending Jesus to us was to make the gospel message, the good news of love, real and accessible and practical. And this is a truth that came not from a God that's way out there that we can't know, but this truth came from a God who is as close to us as our next breath. And this is the very heart of the truth that God wanted us to know in Jesus. There's a Christian author who tells a story of a friend of his who uses the phrase, "with witness, W-I-T-H-N-E-S-S, instead of witness. Because he thinks this says better about what God really intends and means for us. That we're witnessing, but that it's about being with someone. And also being with Christ. So that we think of how we live not so much as witness, but as witness. That we learn to be with God and with others. This theme runs throughout Jesus' message in the Gospels, and it's a message that continued to be shared by the disciples as they went out into the world to share this message of love and forgiveness that Jesus brought. But how is it that we live our lives today so that what we're living is what Jesus preached? How will others know what we believe and who we believe we belong to? And the gospel answers that in John's gospel and in others. They will know by our actions and by how we treat each other. That's how they will know. We know who we are and who we belong to. This witness is a powerful concept if you think about it, because it defines us and our faith. And it will be something that we can hand down to generations to come. And it will give something for new believers in Christ to hold on to take root with, so that they too will come to understand that Christ and God are with them in their living. We sang just a moment ago that great classic hymn, Amazing Grace. And you probably know that story, so indulge me for a moment. I want to just remind you just of a few things. John Newton was the writer of that classic hymn, and he was a notorious slave ship captain for most of his early life. But he became converted to Christianity, and the story is that Newton was an avid student of music, and so as he was writing this hymn, it was easy for him to do this in verse. And this was his confession and sort of a autobiographical explanation for how someone could travel so far between one pole of existence and the other, from slave ship owner to a believer in Jesus Christ. And so the words of that hymn have particular meaning to him and should remind us too of who we are as faithful Christians and who we belong to. The first line, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. To Newton, these words of God's grace were like music to his ears. He had lived a life in his early times as this slave ship owner and devalued human life and treated it as a commodity. But now he was hearing different music, and it was beautiful to his ears. And he knew, and the second line is that saved a wretch like me, he felt as if his life was worth nothing. Wretch is about as low as you can go. But he also knew very well that even though his life hadn't had much meaning before, it now could take a turn. Because he knew now, and he says very clearly, I know I can live beyond the guilt and the shame, because he writes next, I once was lost, but now am found. He began to understand that nothing in our lives keeps us from knowing God's forgiveness, for knowing God's grace. And then he says, I was blind, but now I see. He came to an understanding that the road to redemption was his through Christ. That no matter what he had done in the past, his life did not have to be that anymore. And he knew, and he came to know that how he lived and living differently would have an influence on people down the road. And so he made a commitment to live his life completely differently than he had in the beginning. Because he knew that this was a chance to accept God's grace, and it was too great a chance to pass up. One of Newton's most long-lasting friendships was And probably one of the greatest influences that he had in someone else's life was his relationship with William Wilberforce. Wilberforce came from an aristocratic family in Great Britain, and he was instrumental in leading the way for the abolishment of slavery in the British Empire. And it was these two men's friendship and Newton's faith that helped to influence Wilberforce to see the world in a different way and to help that Reformation come about, because Newton began to see, and Wilberforce through him began to see that the world needed to be a better place. So when you hear that Amazing Grace hymn another time, remember that this was written by a man who believed that he was lost beyond measure, beyond hope, and beyond redemption, and then came to realize the freedom of life that he could have through God's grace. So this isn't a song just about Newton either. This is a song about all of us. A song that tells us that God's grace is available to all of us, and that we all at some point in our lives need to remember that it is through God's grace that our lives take on new meaning. Newton's life was changed when he came to know Christ, and through him, I think we could say that the world was changed too. The trouble is that we have short memories, and sometimes we forget that it is through God's grace and through the example of Jesus and the disciples and people that have gone before us, that those are the ones that we're supposed to be exampling our lives after. Those are the ones whose footsteps we're to be following in, and instead we tend to get on board with the world that tells us that our examples should be supermodels or music stars or sports heroes, and we forget that those footsteps are not the ones that take us to the place where we need to go. Because they will know who we are by how we love others. That's the most important thing for us to remember. The examples that we follow are not the examples that give us great advantage in the world. They're not examples that give us great access to money necessarily, or to fame and fortune, but the footsteps of who we follow in dictates to us how God is a part of our life, and we need to be looking for examples to follow, to make sure that our life is an example to those that come behind us. Nothing testifies more to the person that you are and the person that you and who you belong to than the way you treat others. And nothing defines where you have been and signals to people where you are going more than the example that you give for others of Christ's love in your life. The most important thing for us to remember is that as we walk this path, others are watching. And we need to ask ourselves, what will they see?